The scream tore through the east wing before the clock had even finished striking midnight. Eleanor Whitmore was out of bed and running before she had fully opened her eyes, her bare feet slapping against the cold stone floor, her candle forgotten on the nightstand. She did not need light to find her way to the nursery. She had walked that corridor so many nights in the past year that her feet knew every turn, every uneven flagstone, every place where the old rugs had worn thin. She pushed open the door to find Henry sitting bolt upright in his bed, his small body shaking, his eyes wide and unseeing in the darkness. He was crying the way children cry, when the fear is still inside the dream, when they have not yet returned fully to the waking world. "I am here," Eleanor said, crossing the room in 3 quick steps. She sat on the edge of the bed and gathered him against her, feeling his heart hammering through his thin nightshirt. "I am here, Henry. You are safe. Nothing can reach you now." He did not answer with words. He never did. Not during these episodes. He simply pressed his face into her shoulder and let out a long, shuddering breath, the kind that comes after the worst of the fear has passed, but before the body has caught up to the news. She held him and began to hum, low and soft, a tune she could not remember learning, but which had lived in her since childhood. It was not a lullaby anyone had taught her on purpose. It was simply a sound that had always calmed her, and it seemed, blessedly, to calm Henry too. Slowly his small fists unclenched from the fabric of her sleeping gown. Slowly his breathing slowed to match her own. She did not know, as she sat there in the dim room with the boy's weight settling into her arms, that she was being watched. Duke Edmund Ashworth stood in the shadow of the doorway, one hand braced against the frame, unmoving. He had come to the nursery for reasons he could not have named even to himself. Perhaps it was habit, the old instinct of a father checking on a sleeping child, though it was an instinct he rarely allowed himself to follow through to completion. Perhaps it was something else, some restlessness that had driven him from his study and up the stairs without any clear purpose. Whatever had brought him, he had not expected to find this. He had not expected to see his son, who flinched from his own father's presence more often than not, curled so completely into the arms of a woman who was, by any measure of the household's hierarchy, barely more than a servant. He had not expected to hear that small, unpracticed hum, or to watch his son's trembling stop, or to feel something crack open in his own chest that he had believed sealed shut for good. He did not step into the room. He told himself it was because he did not wish to startle the boy, that the sight of him now, in the doorway at midnight, might undo whatever peace the governess had managed to build. That was true as far as it went. But there was another truth beneath it, one he was not yet ready to examine, which was that he did not trust his own voice not to break if he tried to speak. So he stood in the dark and watched a woman he had scarcely noticed in the 2 years she had lived under his roof, and he felt, for the first time since his wife had died, something that was not entirely grief. He withdrew before either of them could see him. He told himself this was for their sake. He told himself many things that night, walking the long corridor back to his study, none of which he quite believed. Eleanor knew none of this. She stayed with Henry until his breathing deepened into true sleep, until his small hand, still curled loosely around a fold of her sleeve, finally went slack. Only then did she ease him back against his pillow, draw the blanket to his chin, and sit a moment longer in the quiet, watching the rise and fall of his chest the way she had watched it nearly every night for a year, ever since old Mrs. Ferris had given up trying to manage the boy and Eleanor, then newly arrived and grateful simply to have a roof over her head, had quietly taken up the task no one else wanted. She had not been hired as a nurse. She had come to Ashworth Hall as a distant and impoverished relation of the housekeeper, a young woman with no fortune, no family willing to keep her, and no particular skill to recommend her beyond a steady hand and a patient temper. She had been given a small room in the servants' wing, and a vague understanding that she would make herself useful in whatever way the house required. What the house required, it turned out, was someone willing to sit with a motherless boy through the long nights when grief made him afraid of the dark, and to do it without complaint, without seeking credit, and without expecting anything in return. She had never minded. Henry had lost his mother before he was old enough to properly remember her face, and his father, the Duke, had retreated so far into his own sorrow that he had become, in the boy's eyes, less a comfort than a distant and frightening figure who appeared rarely and said little when he did. Someone had to hold the child when the nightmares came. Eleanor had simply been the one who noticed and who stayed. She rose at last, smoothing her nightgown, and made her way back toward the servants' stair. She did not know that the Duke had seen her. She did not know that anything had changed. As far as she understood her place in the house, she was exactly what she had always been. Useful, unremarkable, and easily overlooked. That was how Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, found her the next morning, moving quietly through the breakfast room with a tray of tea things, when Lady Constance Vale swept through the front doors in a cloud of expensive perfume and louder opinions. "Is that the girl?" Lady Constance asked Mrs. Pruitt, not troubling to lower her voice, as though Eleanor were a piece of furniture that happened to be listening. "The one who minds the boy?" "Miss Whitmore, my lady," Mrs. Pruitt said carefully. "She has been a great help to Master Henry." "How charitable of the Duke to keep her on," Lady Constance said, studying Eleanor with the particular coolness of a woman assessing a rival she has not yet decided is worth the trouble of hating. "I do hope she remembers her place once there is a proper mistress in this house again." Eleanor kept her eyes on the tea tray and said nothing. She had learned, in 2 years at Ashworth Hall, that silence was often the safest answer to women like Lady Constance, who came to call with increasing frequency, and who spoke, when the Duke was not in the room, as though her future as the next Duchess were already a settled matter. Eleanor did not think of herself as anyone's rival. She did not think of herself in relation to the Duke at all. He was a distant figure to her too, in his own way, a man she saw perhaps twice a week, always briefly, always with the same careful courtesy he might extend to any servant whose name he had troubled himself to learn. She had no reason to believe he thought of her beyond that, and every reason to believe that a woman of her station had no business imagining otherwise. She carried the tray into the drawing room, set it down, and left again before Lady Constance could find another opportunity to remind her of exactly where she stood. What she could not have known, what she would not learn for some time yet, was that the Duke had asked Mrs. Pruitt, only that morning, a single quiet question about the woman who sat with his son at night. It was not a question that revealed much. It was the kind of question a careful man asks when he is not yet ready to admit, even to himself, that something in his carefully guarded life has begun, very slowly, to shift. Mrs. Pruitt had answered honestly, if briefly, and had thought little more of it. The Duke asked after the running of his household often enough. There was no reason to imagine this question was any different from the 100 others that came before it. But it was different, and somewhere behind the closed door of his study, Edmund Ashworth sat with a letter he was not reading, his mind returning again and again to the sound of a woman humming in the dark, and to the way his son, who flinched from nearly everyone, had not flinched from her at all. He did not yet understand what he was feeling. He only knew that for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, he had wanted to stay in that doorway and watch a little longer. Later that afternoon, he found an excuse to walk past the nursery himself, something he had not done in months. He told himself he was simply inspecting the house, as any landlord might, checking that the roof had not begun to leak again over the west corner, that the windows had been properly sealed against the coming autumn chill. The nursery lay nowhere near the west corner, and both men and women in his household would have known better than to believe such an excuse, had any of them dared to voice their doubts aloud. Through the half-open door, he saw Eleanor kneeling on the floor with Henry, a set of wooden blocks scattered between them. She was not simply minding the boy in the detached way of a servant fulfilling a duty. She was building something with him, a tower, and when it toppled she laughed, a real laugh, unguarded and warm, and to the Duke's astonishment, his son laughed too. He could not remember the last time he had heard that sound. He stood there longer than he intended, hidden by the angle of the door, watching the two of them stack the blocks again, watching Eleanor praise every small success with a gentleness that seemed to come to her without effort, as though kindness were simply the shape her nature took by default, rather than something she had to reach for. She spoke to Henry not as a child to be managed but as a small person worth listening to, asking him questions about which color he wanted next, letting him decide when the tower had grown tall enough, laughing again when it inevitably fell. Edmund thought of his late wife, briefly, painfully, the way he still thought of her at unexpected moments, a stab of loss that never seemed to dull no matter how many months passed. She had been like this with Henry, in the brief time she had been given. Warm, patient, present in a way he had never quite managed to be, even before grief had hollowed him out entirely. He turned from the doorway before either of them noticed him, walking back toward his study with a heaviness in his chest that he could not name, though it felt less like grief than it had in a very long time. That evening, at dinner, he asked Mrs. Pruitt, in the same careful, unremarkable tone he had used that morning, whether Miss Whitmore had everything she required. The housekeeper, mildly surprised, assured him that she did. He nodded, said nothing further, and did not raise the subject again for several days. But something had shifted in him, quietly, the way the first frost of the season arrives without announcement, settling over the grass in the night so that one wakes to find the world already changed. He began, without quite admitting it to himself, to notice things he had not noticed before. The particular quiet with which Eleanor moved through the house, the way the other servants spoke of her with genuine fondness rather than mere obligation, the way his son, who had grown so guarded and so careful with everyone else since his mother's death, seemed to soften the moment she entered a room. He did not yet know what to do with any of it. He only knew that the house felt different to him now, as though a lamp had been lit in a room he had long assumed was permanently dark, and that he found himself, against every instinct that had governed his life for the past 2 years, wanting to walk toward the light rather than away from it. Lady Constance Vale did not knock before entering the nursery. She simply opened the door, stepped inside as though she already owned the room, and stood surveying the scene before her with an expression of faint distaste, as if the very presence of a child's toys offended her sense of order. "Miss Whitmore," she said, her voice pleasant in the way that a blade is pleasant, smooth and cold and edged, "I wonder if I might have a word." Eleanor rose from where she had been kneeling beside Henry, brushing the dust of the nursery floor from her skirt. "Of course, my lady." Lady Constance waited until Henry had wandered to the far side of the room, absorbed in his wooden horse, before she continued. "I understand you have been with this family for some time now. 2 years, is it?" "Nearly 2 years, yes." "And in that time, I imagine you have grown quite attached to the boy." "I am fond of Master Henry, yes." "How touching." Lady Constance's smile did not reach her eyes. "You must understand, Miss Whitmore, that fondness is not the same as position. When I become mistress of this house, and I assure you that day is coming sooner than you might think, certain arrangements will need to change. A child of Henry's rank cannot be raised by a governess who forgets herself. He will need a proper nurse, someone trained for the role, not a poor relation of the housekeeper who happened to be convenient." Eleanor felt the words land like small, precise blows, each one aimed at a place she had not realized was still tender. She kept her face composed. She had learned long ago that women like Lady Constance fed on visible distress, and she would not give her the satisfaction. "I understand, my lady," she said simply. "Master Henry's welfare has always been my only concern." "How very noble of you." Lady Constance's gaze swept the room once more, lingering on the blocks scattered across the floor, the small drawings pinned to the wall that Henry had made under Eleanor's patient guidance. "Do enjoy this arrangement while it lasts." She left as abruptly as she had come, and Eleanor stood for a long moment in the silence that followed, her hands pressed flat against her skirt to keep them from trembling. She was not surprised by the visit. Lady Constance had been calling on Ashworth Hall with increasing frequency for months, and her manner toward the staff, and toward Eleanor in particular, had grown steadily colder. What surprised her was how much the words still managed to hurt, how easily they found the fear she had carried quietly since the day she arrived at the estate with nothing but a single trunk and a letter of introduction from a housekeeper who was, by then, her only remaining family in the world. She had nowhere else to go. If Lady Constance became Duchess and decided Eleanor was no longer wanted, there would be no other position waiting for her, no family home to return to, no fortune to fall back upon. She had built her entire small world within the walls of Ashworth Hall, around a boy who had needed her more than anyone had ever needed her before, and the thought of losing that world was more frightening than she liked to admit even to herself. She crossed the room and knelt beside Henry, who looked up at her with the open, trusting expression that had become, over 2 years, the anchor of her days. "Miss Eleanor," he said, holding up his wooden horse, "will you make him jump the fence?" "Of course I will," she said, and made herself smile, and pushed Lady Constance's words to the back of her mind, at least for now. That evening, after Henry had been settled for the night, Eleanor made her way down to the kitchens, where Mrs. Pruitt was going over the household accounts by candlelight. The older woman looked up as Eleanor entered and, seeing something in her expression, set down her pen. "What has happened?" "Nothing," Eleanor said, though her voice did not entirely convince either of them. "Lady Constance came to the nursery today." Mrs. Pruitt's mouth tightened. "That woman has been sniffing around this house like a fox near a henhouse for the better part of a year. Pay her no mind, Eleanor. She has no more power over this household than she does over the weather. She may soon have a great deal more, if the Duke marries her." "If," Mrs. Pruitt said, with a certainty that surprised Eleanor. "I have served this family for 20 years, child, and I have watched the Duke turn away from every ambitious woman who has come sniffing at his door since his wife passed. Lady Constance is neither the first nor, I suspect, the most persistent, though she is certainly the loudest." She seemed quite confident. "Confidence is cheap," Mrs. Pruitt said, returning to her accounts. "Character is not. The Duke may be a grieving man, but he is not a foolish one. Now sit down and have some tea before you worry yourself into a state over a woman who has done nothing but talk." Eleanor obeyed, grateful for the housekeeper's steady presence, though the unease Lady Constance had planted did not entirely fade. She thought of Henry, asleep upstairs, and of the 2 years she had spent learning the particular rhythms of his fears and his small joys, the way he needed to be told 3 times that a lamp would stay lit before he could fall asleep, the way he hummed to himself when he was concentrating, the way his laughter, once so rare, had grown more frequent as the months passed. She thought of how much of herself she had poured into this small, quiet life, and how easily it seemed it could all be taken from her by a woman who had known the boy for a matter of months and cared for him not at all. She did not sleep well that night. She lay awake in her narrow bed in the servants' wing, listening to the house settle around her, and told herself, as she often did in such moments, that worry changed nothing, that she would simply continue doing what she had always done, and let the future arrive as it would. She did not know that 2 floors above her, the Duke was equally awake, equally troubled, though his thoughts moved along a very different path. Edmund had overheard the tail end of Lady Constance's conversation with Mrs. Pruitt, quite by accident, as he passed through the corridor outside the kitchen on his way to check on a matter of estate business. He had not meant to listen. He had simply found himself unable to walk on once he heard Eleanor's name, and by the time he realized what he was doing, he had already heard enough to feel a slow, unfamiliar anger building in his chest. He had known, in the vague way a man knows things he has not troubled himself to examine closely, that Lady Constance considered herself his likely future wife. He had allowed the assumption to persist largely out of inattention, too consumed by his own grief to properly discourage her, and too indifferent to the question of remarriage to see any urgency in correcting her. It had seemed, for a long time, a matter of no real consequence. Let her believe what she liked. He had no intention of marrying anyone, least of all a woman whose interest in his son extended no further than the inconvenience the boy represented to her ambitions. But hearing her speak of Eleanor with such casual cruelty, hearing her threaten, however indirectly, the removal of the one person who had managed to reach his son when no one else could, stirred something in him he had not expected. It was not merely anger on Eleanor's behalf, though that was part of it. It was something closer to fear, a sudden, sharp awareness of how much he had come to depend, without ever admitting it, on the quiet stability she had brought to his household. He thought of the previous night, the sound of her humming in the dark, the sight of Henry's small hand curled trustingly around her sleeve. He thought of the wooden tower falling, and the laughter that had followed, a sound so foreign to his house that he had nearly forgotten what it meant. He did not go to Eleanor that night. He did not yet know what he would say, or whether he had any right to say anything at all. But he lay awake for a long time, turning the matter over in his mind, and when sleep finally came, it was with a new and unfamiliar resolve settling quietly beneath his grief, that whatever else happened in this house, whatever Lady Constance believed about her own future, he would not allow the one source of true warmth his son had found to be so easily discarded. He did not yet understand what that resolve meant, or where it might lead him. He only knew that something had changed, and that he was no longer content to remain a distant observer of his own life. The following morning, Lady Constance appeared at breakfast uninvited, a habit she had cultivated over the past several months, that no one in the household felt empowered to discourage. She swept into the dining room in a gown of deep blue silk, far too fine for a simple morning call, and settled herself across from the Duke with the easy familiarity of a woman who considered the seat already hers by right. "You look tired, Edmund," she said, pouring herself tea without waiting to be offered any. "I do hope you are not overtaxing yourself with estate matters. A man in your position ought to have someone to share the burden." "I manage well enough," Edmund said, his tone carefully neutral. "Of course you do. You have managed remarkably, all things considered. But managing is not the same as living, is it? It has been 2 years, Edmund. No one would think less of you for beginning to look toward the future again." He set down his own cup with more precision than the gesture required. "I look toward the future every day, Lady Constance. My son requires nothing less of me." "Your son?" She said the words with a faint, practiced smile. "Yes, of course. Though I confess I worry for the boy, being raised so much by servants. A child of his station ought to have proper guidance, not simply whoever happens to be available in the household." "Miss Whitmore is not simply available," Edmund said, and heard the edge in his own voice before he had fully decided to let it show. "She has given my son more genuine care in 2 years than half the trained nurses in England could manage in 10. Lady Constance's eyes flickered, surprised, perhaps, by the sudden warmth in his defense. She recovered quickly, smoothing her expression back into practiced pleasantness. I only meant that when the time comes for proper arrangements to be made, one hopes sentiment will not stand in the way of what is best for the boy's future. I assure you, Edmund said, rising from the table before the conversation could continue, that whatever arrangements are made in this house will be made with a great deal of thought, and very little sentiment of the kind you seem to be imagining. He left the room without a backward glance, leaving Lady Constance alone with her tea, and an expression that had, for the first time since her calls began, lost some of its confidence. Upstairs, unaware of the conversation taking place below, Eleanor spent the morning as she spent most mornings, guiding Henry through his letters at the small writing desk that had been moved into the nursery for that purpose. He was a bright child when he was not afraid, quick to grasp new ideas once he felt safe enough to try them, and she took quiet pride in watching him form his letters with growing confidence, his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. "Miss Eleanor," he said, looking up from his slate, "will you always be here?" The question caught her off guard, simple as it was. She had learned, over 2 years, that Henry's questions often carried more weight than their words suggested. Small windows into fears he did not yet have the language to express directly. "I will be here for as long as I am able," she said carefully, choosing honesty over easy comfort. "And even if things should ever change, you will always have people who care for you. Your grandmother, your father." "Papa is always busy," Henry said, returning his attention to his slate with the matter-of-fact resignation of a child who has long since stopped expecting otherwise. Eleanor said nothing to that, though the words settled uncomfortably in her chest. She had watched, over the months, the careful distance the Duke maintained from his son, a distance she had come to understand was born of grief rather than indifference, though she doubted Henry, at his age, could make such a distinction. To a 5-year-old boy, an absent father was simply an absent father, whatever sorrow lay behind the absence. She did not know that the very man they spoke of had, only the day before, stood in this same doorway and watched them build a tower of wooden blocks, with an expression she would not have recognized on his face. So unfamiliar was warmth to the version of him she thought she knew. The day passed as most days did, in the small, steady rhythms of the nursery. Lessons in the morning, a walk in the garden when the weather allowed, quiet play in the afternoon while the light faded toward evening. Eleanor did not see the Duke at all, which was not unusual, though she found herself, without quite admitting why, glancing toward the doorway once or twice, with an odd sense of expectation that she could not explain, and did not examine too closely. It was only as she was preparing Henry for bed that evening that she learned, from a passing remark by one of the housemaids, that Lady Constance had called again that morning, and that the Duke had left the breakfast table, rather abruptly following some exchange between them. The maid did not know the particulars, only that Lady Constance had seemed, for once, less pleased with herself upon her departure than usual. Eleanor told herself the matter did not concern her. She had no place in whatever conversations passed between the Duke and the woman who intended, by all accounts, to become his wife. And yet she found herself thinking of it long after Henry had fallen asleep, turning the small fragment of gossip over in her mind as she made her way back to her own quiet room, wondering, against her better judgment, what exactly had been said, and why it should matter to her at all. She did not allow herself to finish the thought. Some doors, she had learned, were safer left unopened, and the question of what the Duke might think of her, beyond the simple gratitude owed to a woman who cared well for his son, was one of them. The fever came without warning, the way the worst things always seem to arrive at Ashworth Hall. Eleanor noticed it first at supper, when Henry pushed his food around his plate without eating, and complained, in the small, uncertain voice he used when something troubled him, that his head hurt. By the time she had him settled for bed, his cheeks had flushed a deep, alarming red, and when she pressed her hand to his forehead, the heat radiating from his skin sent a jolt of fear straight through her chest. "Fetch the physician," she told the housemaid who had come to help turn down the beds, her voice sharper than she intended. "Now please, do not wait." The maid fled, and Eleanor turned back to Henry, who had begun to shiver despite the heat coming off his small body, his teeth chattering as he curled into himself beneath the blankets. "I am cold," he whispered. "I know," she said, gathering him against her, feeling the unnatural warmth of him through the thin fabric of his nightshirt. "I know, my love. I am right here." She did not remember, later, deciding to stay with him through the night. It was simply a certainty that settled over her the moment the fever revealed itself, as unshakable as breathing. She sat on the edge of his bed with him curled against her chest, murmuring soft, meaningless comfort into his hair, and did not move even when Mrs. Pruitt arrived some 20 minutes later, with cool cloths and a basin of water, her own face drawn with worry. "The physician has been sent for," Mrs. Pruitt said, setting the basin down and wringing out a cloth. "Dr. Langley lives only 2 miles distant. He should not be long." 2 miles is too far, Eleanor said, though she knew the words changed nothing. She pressed the cool cloth to Henry's forehead herself, refusing Mrs. Pruitt's offer to take over, and continued the low, steady murmur of comfort that seemed, if nothing else, to keep the boy from crying, though his small body still trembled with chills that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. It was well past midnight when Dr. Langley finally arrived, his coat still damp from the night air, his bag already open before he had fully crossed the threshold of the nursery. He examined Henry with brisk efficiency, listening to his chest, checking the color of his throat, pressing careful fingers to the glands beneath his jaw. "A fever of the throat," he pronounced at last, "not uncommon in children his age, and not, in most cases, dangerous, provided it is watched carefully through the night. The fever must be kept from climbing too high. Cool cloths, small sips of water, and someone at his side to wake him should his breathing change." "I will stay," Eleanor said, before Mrs. Pruitt could offer to take a turn. Dr. Langley glanced at her, taking in, perhaps for the first time, the particular quality of her attention, the way she had not once loosened her hold on the boy since he had entered the room. "You are not his mother." "No," Eleanor said simply. "But I have cared for him since he was small enough to need it, and I do not intend to stop now." Something in her tone must have satisfied him, because he nodded, gave Mrs. Pruitt instructions for the mixture to be prepared should the fever worsen, and took his leave with a promise to return by midday. Eleanor did not sleep that night. She sat with Henry through the long, dark hours, changing the cool cloths on his forehead each time they grew warm, coaxing small sips of water past his cracked lips whenever he stirred enough to take them, humming the same wordless tune she had hummed to him 100 times before, though tonight it seemed to carry more weight than usual, as though the sound itself might somehow hold the fever at bay. Toward the darkest part of the night, somewhere past 3, Henry's breathing changed, growing shallow and quick, and Eleanor felt real fear for the first time since the illness had announced itself. She pressed her palm to his chest, counting the rapid rise and fall beneath her fingers, and called for Mrs. Pruitt, in a voice that carried an urgency she had not allowed herself until now. "His breathing," she said, when the housekeeper appeared, bleary-eyed, in the doorway. "Something is wrong." Mrs. Pruitt crossed the room quickly, pressing her own hand to the boy's forehead, and her expression tightened with a concern that did nothing to ease Eleanor's fear. "The fever has climbed. We must send for Dr. Langley again." It was in this moment, with Henry's breath coming fast and shallow between them, and the housemaid already running for the stables, that the Duke appeared in the doorway. He had not been sleeping. He had spent the past several hours in his study, unable to settle to any task, some restless unease keeping him from his bed though he could not have named its source. When the commotion reached him, the sound of hurried footsteps and low, urgent voices carrying through the quiet house, he had followed it without hesitation, and now he stood frozen in the nursery doorway, taking in the scene before him with an expression Eleanor had never seen on his face. "What has happened?" His voice cracked slightly on the question, all his usual careful composure abandoned. "A fever," Mrs. Pruitt said quickly. "Dr. Langley has already examined him once tonight, but his breathing has grown difficult in the last quarter hour. We have sent for the doctor again." Edmund crossed the room in 3 long strides and knelt beside the bed, his eyes moving over his son's flushed face, his damp hair plastered to his forehead, his small chest rising and falling too quickly beneath the thin nightshirt. "Henry." His voice broke completely on the name, all pretense gone. The boy's eyes fluttered open, glassy with fever, and for a moment he seemed not to recognize the face above him. Then, slowly, his gaze found Eleanor's, and some of the panic in his small features eased, though his breathing did not slow. "Miss Eleanor," he whispered. "I am here," she said, and did not let go of his hand. Edmund watched this exchange with an expression Eleanor could not read, something raw and unguarded that seemed entirely at odds with the distant, careful man she had known for 2 years. He reached out, tentatively, and pressed his own hand against Henry's cheek, as though testing whether the boy would flinch from the contact as he so often did. Henry did not flinch. He turned his face slightly into his father's palm, too exhausted and too frightened by the fever to maintain his usual guarded distance, and something in Edmund's face cracked open entirely. "What can I do?" he asked, looking between Eleanor and Mrs. Pruitt with an urgency that neither woman had ever heard from him before. "Tell me what to do." "Hold him," Eleanor said gently, while I prepare a fresh cloth. He needs to feel that he is not alone. Edmund hesitated only a moment before gathering his son into his arms, careful and clumsy in a way that spoke of long, unpracticed instinct rather than any lack of feeling. Henry curled against his father's chest, and Edmund held him the way Eleanor had held him countless nights before, rocking slightly, murmuring words too quiet for her to hear. She turned away to wring out a fresh cloth, giving them what privacy the small room allowed, and found her own eyes stinging with tears she had not expected. She had spent 2 years believing the Duke incapable of this kind of tenderness, had watched him retreat from his son so many times that she had come to think the distance between them permanent, a wound too old to heal. To see it breaking open now, in the worst possible circumstances, filled her with an emotion she could not name, something that was not quite relief, and not quite grief, but some tangled combination of both. Dr. Langley returned within the hour, his examination this time more thorough, his expression, when he finished, cautiously reassuring. The fever has not worsened beyond what is typical for this illness. His breathing was strained by fear as much as by fever, I suspect. Children often panic when the body feels unfamiliar to them, and panic itself can quicken the breath. He should improve steadily now, provided he is kept calm and comfortable. Edmund did not release his hold on Henry, even as the doctor packed away his instruments and gave his final instructions to Mrs. Pruitt. He remained on the edge of the bed long after the house had settled back into its uneasy quiet, his son asleep at last against his chest, and when he finally looked up and met Eleanor's eyes across the dim room, something passed between them that neither had words for yet. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for staying with him, for all the nights I did not know to be grateful for." "He is a good boy," Eleanor said, her voice unsteady. "He deserves care, whatever form it comes in." "He deserves more than he has had from me," Edmund said, and the honesty in the admission startled them both. "I have let my own grief keep me from him for too long. I see that now, more clearly than I have allowed myself to see it in 2 years." Eleanor did not know how to answer that, so she said nothing, and simply moved to sit in the chair beside the bed, close enough to reach Henry if he needed her, close enough, though she did not let herself think too much of it, to remain near the man who held him. They sat in silence for a long while, the three of them, as the worst of the night passed and Henry's breathing settled at last into the deep, even rhythm of true rest. Outside, the first gray light of dawn had begun to creep over the horizon, and somewhere in the house a rooster crowed, ordinary and unaware of the long night that had just ended. "You have given him something I could not," Edmund said eventually, his voice low, careful, as though he were still finding his way toward whatever he meant to say, "a sense of safety. I do not know how to thank you for that, beyond the wages this house pays you, which feel entirely insufficient to the truth of what you have done." "You owe me nothing," Eleanor said. "I care for him because I love him, not because I expect anything in return." Something shifted in Edmund's expression at those words, something she could not name, though she felt its weight settle into the room between them like a held breath. He did not answer, not then, but his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than courtesy required, and when he finally looked away, it was with the particular reluctance of a man leaving something he was not yet ready to leave. Neither of them spoke of it again that night, but something had shifted, quietly and irrevocably, in the long hours between midnight and dawn, and both of them, in their own way, carried the weight of that change into the days that followed. Henry's fever broke by the following afternoon, leaving him weak but steadily recovering, and within 2 days he was well enough to sit up in bed and demand, with the particular insistence of a child returning to health, that Eleanor read to him from his favorite book of animal stories. She obliged gladly, grateful beyond words to see the color return to his cheeks and the light back in his eyes, though she noticed, with a quiet warmth she did not examine too closely, that the Duke had taken to visiting the nursery each afternoon during Henry's convalescence, something he had never done before. At first his visits were brief and somewhat awkward, a man unused to the rhythms of a sick room standing uncertainly near the door, unsure of his welcome. But Henry's delight at seeing him each time worked a slow, steady change, and by the 3rd day, Edmund had taken to sitting in the chair beside the bed himself, listening as Eleanor read, occasionally adding his own voice to a particularly exciting passage, earning delighted laughter from his son that seemed to startle Edmund each time it came, as though he could not quite believe he was the one causing it. Eleanor watched these small, halting steps toward connection with a fullness in her chest she had not expected. She had spent 2 years wishing, quietly and without much hope, that the Duke might find his way back to his son. To watch it happening now, however slowly, however tentatively, felt like witnessing something rare and fragile, a thing that might yet be broken if handled carelessly, but which was, for the moment, undeniably real. On the fourth day, with Henry finally strong enough to sit up in the garden for a short while, Eleanor took him outside to enjoy the mild afternoon air, wrapping him warmly against any lingering chill. She had not expected the Duke to join them, but he appeared not long after, standing at first at a slight distance before Henry called out to him, delighted, and patted the bench beside himself with an insistence that made refusal impossible. They sat together in the garden as the afternoon light softened toward evening, Henry chattering happily between them about the birds he could see in the hedgerow, his energy slowly returning with each passing hour. Eleanor found herself, more than once, catching Edmund's eye over the boy's head, and each time, something quiet and unspoken passed between them, an understanding neither of them yet had words for, though both felt its presence keenly. It did not go unnoticed. Lady Constance, arriving unannounced that same afternoon as was her habit, found the small scene through the drawing-room window, and stood watching it for a long moment before her expression hardened into something considerably less pleasant than her usual practiced smile. She said nothing to anyone that day, offering only a brief and uncharacteristically subdued greeting before departing earlier than expected, but the housemaid who had witnessed her expression through the glass reported to Mrs. Pruitt, in a hushed and worried voice, that Lady Constance had looked in that moment like a woman who had just realized she was losing something she had believed already won. Mrs. Pruitt, for her part, said only that some battles were lost long before anyone troubled to notice the fighting had begun, and left it at that, though she watched Eleanor with a new and careful attention in the days that followed, as though weighing something in her own mind that she was not yet ready to speak aloud. Eleanor noticed none of this. She was too consumed by the quiet, unfamiliar happiness of watching Henry heal, and of watching his father find his way, slowly and imperfectly, back into his son's life. She did not yet understand how precarious that happiness was, or how quickly the ground beneath her might shift once others began to notice what she herself had only just begun to feel. That evening, once Henry had been settled for the night, still tired from his afternoon in the garden but sleeping soundly and without fever for the first time in days, Eleanor found herself lingering in the nursery longer than usual, unwilling to break the quiet contentment of the day just past. She was folding a small stack of Henry's clothes, more from habit than necessity, when she heard footsteps in the corridor and looked up to find the Duke standing in the doorway once more, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. "He is sleeping well," Edmund said, though it was not quite a question. "Very well," Eleanor confirmed. "The fever has left him tired, but the worst has passed." He nodded, though he made no move to leave, and for a moment, the silence between them stretched, comfortable in a way that surprised them both. "I have not thanked you properly," he said at last. "Not for tonight alone, but for all of it. 2 years of care that I allowed to go unnoticed, out of grief, out of cowardice, if I am honest with myself. I see now what that cost my son, what it nearly cost him." "You are here now," Eleanor said gently. "That is what matters to him. Children forgive more easily than we imagine, if we simply give them reason to. I hope you are right." He looked toward the bed, where Henry slept peacefully, one small hand curled beneath his cheek. "I do not intend to disappear again. Whatever else changes in this house, that much I have decided." Eleanor felt something warm and unfamiliar settle in her chest at those words, a quiet hope she had not allowed herself in a very long time. She said nothing of it, only nodded, and bid him good night before making her own way back to her small room in the servants' wing, carrying with her the sense that something in Ashworth Hall had begun, however quietly, to change for good. The accusation arrived in the form of a letter, delivered to the Duke's study on a gray morning 10 days after Henry's fever had broken, and Eleanor learned of its existence only when she was summoned, without explanation, to appear before him that same afternoon. She had never been summoned to the study before. In 2 years at Ashworth Hall, her interactions with the Duke had taken place almost entirely within the nursery or the garden, brief and informal, shaped by the presence of his son rather than any direct address to her alone. The formality of the summons, delivered by Mr. Bellamy, the butler, with a careful blankness that told her nothing of what awaited her, sent a cold thread of dread through her chest as she made her way down the long corridor toward the closed study door. She found Edmund standing by the window, a letter held loosely in one hand, his expression unreadable. He turned as she entered, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Please, sit," he said finally, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. Eleanor sat, her hands folded carefully in her lap, though her heart was beating fast enough that she felt certain he must be able to hear it. "I have received a letter," Edmund said, "from Lady Constance's father, Lord Vale. It contains an accusation I find difficult to credit, but which I am obligated, as master of this house, to bring before you directly." "What accusation, my lord?" "That you have used your position within this household to insinuate yourself into affections that are not properly yours to claim. That your care for my son has, in recent weeks, extended beyond appropriate bounds into something Lord Vale characterizes as designing and improper. He suggests, in language I will not repeat in full, that your recent closeness to my family has been calculated rather than genuine, and that your continued presence in this house represents a danger to its reputation." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. "My lord, I assure you, nothing I have done." "I know," Edmund said, before she could finish, his voice firm enough that she stopped, startled. "I know it is not true, Eleanor. I have watched you with my son for 2 years. I have watched you sit through fevered nights and endless small kindnesses that no one asked of you and no one, until recently, properly thanked you for. Whatever Lord Vale believes, or whatever his daughter has told him to believe, I do not doubt your character for a moment." Relief flooded through her, sharp enough to leave her briefly unable to speak. "Then why summon me at all, if you do not believe it?" Edmund's jaw tightened. "Because the accusation, however baseless, carries weight beyond this room. Lord Vale is not a man to be dismissed lightly, and Lady Constance has clearly decided that removing you from this household serves her interests. If I do nothing, the rumor will spread regardless of its truth, and it is you who will bear the cost of it, not her." "What would you have me do?" Eleanor asked, though she feared she already knew the answer, and felt something cold settle in her stomach at the thought of it. "Nothing," Edmund said, surprising her. "I would have you do nothing at all, because I do not intend to let this stand unanswered. I will not dismiss you, Eleanor, whatever pressure Lord Vale or his daughter may attempt to bring to bear, but I wished you to hear the accusation from me directly, rather than through the distorted version that will inevitably reach you through the servants' gossip, and I wished you to know that I do not believe a word of it." Eleanor sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing the weight of what he had said, both the accusation itself and his firm rejection of it. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice unsteady. "I did not expect such certainty from you." "You have earned it," Edmund said simply. "Whatever else Lady Constance imagines about her place in this house, she has never earned the kind of trust you have built here, not in all the months she has been calling. I see the difference clearly now, even if I was slow to see it before." He did not say more than that, though something in his expression suggested there was more he might have said, had the circumstances allowed it. Eleanor rose to leave, uncertain what else remained to be discussed, and had nearly reached the door when he spoke again. "Eleanor." She turned back. "For what it is worth, I intend to speak with Lady Constance directly. This will not happen again." She nodded, though she left the study with her mind spinning, uncertain whether to feel relief at his defense of her, or fresh anxiety at the thought of what Lady Constance might attempt next, now that her first move had failed to achieve its purpose. She did not have long to wonder. 2 days later, at a small gathering held at Ashworth Hall to mark the recovery of Henry's health, a gathering attended by several of the county's prominent families including, unavoidably, Lady Constance and her father, the matter came to a head in a manner none of them had anticipated. Eleanor had not been meant to attend the gathering itself, her place being in the nursery with Henry rather than among the assembled guests, but Henry had grown fretful at being separated from her during the early part of the evening, and Edmund, against the protests of propriety that such an arrangement might have provoked in a different household, had asked her to bring the boy down briefly to greet the guests before returning him to bed. It was a small kindness, meant only to ease Henry's anxiety, but it placed Eleanor directly in the path of Lady Constance, who watched the scene unfold from across the drawing room with an expression that grew colder by the minute, as she observed how easily Henry's hand found Eleanor's, how naturally he leaned into her side, when the unfamiliar crowd of adults grew overwhelming, how the Duke himself glanced toward Eleanor more than once with an expression entirely unsuited to a man addressing his son's governess. When Eleanor finally excused herself to return Henry to the nursery, Lady Constance followed, catching her in the corridor beyond the drawing room where she believed, wrongly, that no one else would overhear. "You think yourself very clever," Lady Constance said, her voice low and sharp, all pretense of pleasantness abandoned now that the audience of the drawing room could no longer see her. "Worming your way into his affections through the child. Do you imagine he will marry you, Miss Whitmore? A duke, marrying a governess with no fortune and no family to speak of? You would be the laughingstock of the county, and so would he. I have never sought his affections, Eleanor said, keeping her voice steady though her hands trembled at her sides. I have only ever cared for his son. How convenient that caring for the son should bring you so neatly into the father's notice. Lady Constance's smile was thin and ugly. You forget your place, Miss Whitmore. I do not intend to let you forget it much longer. She did not know, and neither did Eleanor, that the Dowager Duchess Margaret, Edmund's mother, had come down the corridor from the opposite direction and had heard every word of the exchange, standing now in the shadow of a nearby archway, with an expression of quiet, considering interest that neither younger woman had yet noticed. The Dowager Duchess had said little, since her arrival at Ashworth Hall 3 days prior for the gathering, about the changes she had observed in her son and grandson. She was not a woman given to hasty judgments, and she had spent her visit watching, carefully, the way Edmund's household had shifted since her last stay, the ease that had crept back into his manner, the light that had returned to Henry's eyes. She had drawn her own conclusions, quietly, and had said nothing to anyone, waiting to see how the matter would unfold on its own. But hearing Lady Constance's threat delivered with such casual cruelty to a woman who had, by every account reaching the Dowager's ears, done nothing but care faithfully for her grandson, was enough to settle whatever remaining doubts she had been holding in reserve. She stepped out from the archway, and both younger women startled at her sudden appearance. Lady Constance, the Dowager Duchess said, her voice carrying the particular calm authority of a woman who had spent 40 years managing far more difficult company than an ambitious young widow with more ambition than sense. I believe it is time we had a conversation, you and I, perhaps in the drawing room, where the light is better suited to plain speaking. Lady Constance's face drained of color. Your Grace, I did not mean... I heard precisely what you meant, the Dowager said. Come along. She swept past both younger women without another glance, leaving Lady Constance no choice but to follow, her earlier confidence entirely evaporated. Eleanor stood alone in the corridor for a long moment, Henry's small hand still held in her own, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something that felt, cautiously, like hope. She did not know what the Dowager Duchess intended to say, or what consequences might follow from a conversation she had not been meant to witness at all. But she understood, standing there in the quiet corridor with the sounds of the gathering still drifting faintly from the drawing room, that something in the careful balance of Ashworth Hall had just shifted decisively, and that there would be no returning to the way things had been before. She carried Henry up to the nursery, settling him into bed with hands that still trembled faintly from the encounter, and stayed with him until his breathing evened into sleep before allowing herself to sink into the chair beside his bed, exhausted in a way that had little to do with the lateness of the hour. She thought of Lord Vale's letter, of the accusation it had carried, and wondered how many other such letters might follow, how many other attempts Lady Constance might make before either giving up her pursuit of the Duke or succeeding in driving Eleanor from the only home she had known in years. She thought, too, of Edmund's firm defense of her in his study, the certainty in his voice when he had said he did not believe a word of the accusation, and found herself, despite everything, holding on to that certainty like a small warm coal against the cold of her fear. Downstairs, in the drawing room, the Dowager Duchess had drawn Lady Constance aside with a firmness that brooked no argument, and the conversation that followed, though conducted in low and controlled tones, left no doubt in either woman's mind about where matters truly stood. I have watched you circle my son for the better part of a year, the Dowager said, once the drawing-room door had been closed against curious ears. I said nothing, because it was not my place to interfere in his choices, and because I believed, perhaps naively, that his own good sense would eventually prevail without my assistance. I no longer believe I can afford such patience. Your Grace, I have only ever sought. You have sought a title, the Dowager said, cutting her off without raising her voice, and a fortune, and a position in society that your own family's diminished circumstances can no longer provide. I do not fault you for wanting these things, Lady Constance. Many women in your position would want the same. What I fault you for is the manner in which you have pursued them, and the cruelty you have shown toward a young woman who has done nothing but care faithfully for my grandson, while you have done nothing but scheme for his father's title. Lady Constance's composure finally cracked. She is nothing, a governess with no name, no fortune. She sat with my grandson through a fever that frightened even his own father into finally remembering he was a parent, the Dowager said, her voice hard now. She has given that boy more genuine care in 2 years than you have shown him in all your months of calling at this house. I have eyes, Lady Constance, and I have used them well these past 3 days. I suggest you consider very carefully whether you wish to continue a pursuit that has, by every appearance, already been decided against you." She left Lady Constance standing alone in the drawing room, her face pale with a fury she dared not show openly, and returned to the gathering with the composed serenity of a woman who had said precisely what needed saying, and felt no further obligation to dwell on it. Edmund found his mother a short while later, near the refreshment table, and something in her expression told him a conversation of significance had taken place in his absence. "You spoke with her," he said quietly, not quite a question. "I did," the dowager confirmed, "and I do not believe she will trouble your household again, though I would not count on her father's restraint being quite so easily secured. Lord Vale is a proud man, and pride does not always yield gracefully to plain truth." Edmund's jaw tightened. "Then I will speak with him myself, if it comes to that." "I rather thought you might." The dowager studied her son for a long moment, something knowing in her expression. "You have changed these past weeks, Edmund. I do not think I need to ask why." He did not answer directly, though the faint color that rose in his face told her everything she needed to know, and she said nothing further on the subject, content, for now, to let matters unfold at their own pace, confident that whatever quiet transformation had taken hold of her son's household, it was one worth protecting rather than questioning too closely. The knock at the nursery door came just after dawn, sharp and insistent enough to wake Eleanor from the light sleep she had fallen into in the chair beside Henry's bed, and when she opened it, she found Mrs. Pruitt standing there with a folded piece of paper clutched in one hand, and an expression of barely contained alarm. "You must come," the housekeeper said, her voice low but urgent. "Now, Eleanor, something has happened." Eleanor glanced back at Henry, still sleeping soundly, before slipping out into the corridor and pulling the door closed behind her. "What is it?" Mrs. Pruitt held out the paper, and Eleanor unfolded it with unsteady hands to find a short, cruelly worded notice, the kind that might be posted or circulated among the county's more gossip-hungry households, accusing her by name of having schemed her way into a position of undue influence within the Ashworth household, of having used a motherless child to secure the affections of a grieving duke for her own financial gain. Where did this come from? "One of the footmen found copies of it left at the village post office and at the Harwick estate," Mrs. Pruitt said grimly. "There is no signature, but we both know whose hand shaped these words, whatever pretense of anonymity she has chosen to hide behind." Eleanor felt the paper tremble in her grip, the careful composure she had maintained through Lord Vale's private letter finally beginning to crack under the weight of this new public assault. "She means to ruin me. She means to frighten you into leaving before matters can develop any further," Mrs. Pruitt said, "and I do not doubt for a moment that his lordship will see through this as quickly as he saw through the last attempt. But you must be prepared, Eleanor, for whispers to follow you, regardless of the truth. That is simply how these things work, unjust as it may be." Eleanor sank against the corridor wall, the notice still clutched in her hand, and for the first time since Lady Constance's campaign against her had begun, she felt something close to despair. She had weathered private threats and cutting words with relative composure, but the sight of her name and character laid bare for public judgment, however baseless the accusations, struck at a fear she had carried since childhood, the fear of being cast out, of having no place in the world that could not be taken from her by someone with more power and less conscience than herself. She did not know, standing there in the quiet gray light of early morning, that Edmund had already received his own copy of the notice, delivered to his study by a groundskeeper who had found it pinned to the estate's front gate sometime in the night, and that he was, at that very moment, in his study composing a letter of his own, one that would leave no ambiguity about where he stood. He arrived at the nursery within the hour, finding Eleanor still in the corridor with Mrs. Pruitt, the notice still trembling faintly in her hand, and his expression, when he saw it, was one of controlled fury barely held in check. "I have seen it," he said, before either woman could speak. "Copies have been left throughout the village and at 3 neighboring estates that I know of already. I intend to answer this publicly and decisively, and I wished you to know before I proceed. My lord, I do not wish to cause you further difficulty." "You have caused no difficulty," Edmund said firmly. "Lady Constance has caused this difficulty, through her own cruelty and her own inability to accept that her ambitions in this house were never going to be realized. I will not allow her to drive you from this household through slander, Eleanor, whatever it costs to answer it properly." He was true to his word. Within 2 days, Edmund had called upon Lord Vale directly, a meeting that several among the household staff described afterward, in hushed and awed tones, as the coldest and most controlled dressing down any of them had ever witnessed the Duke deliver. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He laid out, with methodical precision, the falseness of the accusations against Eleanor, the evidence of 2 years' faithful service that any honest inquiry would readily confirm, and the consequences that would follow, both socially and legally, should the slander continue. The meeting itself took place in Lord Vale's own study, a room considerably smaller and less grand than Edmund's own, though Lord Vale had done his best to arrange the furnishings to suggest an authority he did not, in truth, possess in this particular contest. He had greeted the Duke with a stiff, wary courtesy, offering refreshment that Edmund declined, and had attempted, in the opening moments of their conversation, to frame the notices as an unfortunate misunderstanding rather than a deliberate campaign. "I assure you, Your Grace, my daughter meant no true harm by the matter. A young woman's overzealous concern for a family she has come to regard fondly, nothing more. Overzealous concern does not typically manifest as anonymous slander circulated to 3 neighboring estates," Edmund said, his voice quiet in a way that carried far more weight than any raised tone might have managed. "I have spoken with the postmaster in the village myself, Lord Vale, and with the housekeeper at Harwick, both of whom confirmed the notices were delivered by a messenger in your daughter's employ. I do not raise this to embarrass you further than the matter already has. I raise it because I wish to be entirely clear about what I know, and what I am prepared to do should it continue." Lord Vale's composure faltered slightly. "What is it you require, Your Grace?" "A full and immediate cessation of any further accusations against Miss Whitmore, public or private," Edmund said, "and an understanding, which I trust needs no further elaboration, that any repetition of this conduct will be met with consequences considerably more severe than an uncomfortable conversation in your study." "You go to a great deal of trouble," Lord Vale said, some of his earlier stiffness returning. "For a governess." Edmund's expression hardened in a way that made even a man of Lord Vale's standing take an involuntary step back. "I go to precisely the trouble that any decent man would take, when a member of his household has been slandered without cause by someone seeking to advance her own ambitions at another's expense. Miss Whitmore has served this family with a devotion your daughter never once demonstrated in all her months of calling. I would ask you to consider, Lord Vale, whether the comparison between the 2 women reflects well on the one you have chosen to defend." There was little Lord Vale could say to that which would not further expose the weakness of his position, and he retreated, in the end, into a grudging and carefully worded assurance that the matter would trouble Ashworth Hall no further. Edmund left the meeting with no illusions that the apology offered was sincere, but satisfied that the practical threat had been sufficiently neutralized, and rode back toward his own estate with a grim satisfaction that did little to ease the deeper unease still troubling him. That unease, he came to understand over the following days, was not truly about Lord Vale or his daughter at all. It was about the 2 years he had spent allowing his grief to keep him distant from his own household, distant enough that a woman as devoted and as quietly remarkable as Eleanor Whitmore had gone almost entirely unnoticed by him until circumstance forced his attention toward her. He thought of all the nights she had sat with Henry alone, unthanked and unacknowledged, and felt a fresh wave of something close to shame at how easily he might have continued failing to see her, had the events of recent weeks not finally opened his eyes. Lord Vale, whatever his own ambitions for his daughter's marriage, was not a foolish man, and he understood well enough the danger of continuing a public quarrel with a duke who held considerably more social and financial power than his own family could easily withstand. He offered what amounted to a grudging retraction, promising that no further notices would circulate under his household's authority, though he stopped short of any direct apology to Eleanor herself. Lady Constance, for her part, was not present for this confrontation, having been sent, by her own father's furious command, to stay with distant relations in the north until the scandal she had created could be allowed to quietly fade from local memory. She did not return to Ashworth Hall, then or ever, and the notices that had briefly troubled the village gossip mills were, within a fortnight, largely forgotten in favor of newer and less consequential scandals. But the damage, however contained, had left its mark. Eleanor found herself, in the days following the confrontation, more withdrawn than usual, uncertain of her own place in a household that had so recently been the site of public accusation against her character. She continued her duties with Henry as faithfully as ever, but she carried herself with a new caution, a wariness that had not been present before the notices appeared, and Edmund, watching this change in her, felt a fresh wave of the anger he had directed toward Lord Vale, now turned inward at his own slowness to act. At the months he had allowed Lady Constance's presence to persist in his household without properly examining what it cost the people around him. It was the Dowager Duchess who finally addressed the matter directly, finding Eleanor alone in the garden one afternoon nearly a week after the confrontation with Lord Vale, sitting on the same bench where Henry had chattered happily to his father and his governess in the mild afternoon sun some weeks before. "You look troubled, child," the dowager said, settling herself onto the bench without waiting for an invitation. "I am well, your grace," Eleanor said, though the reply lacked conviction. "You are not well at all, and there is no shame in admitting it." The dowager studied her for a long moment, her expression softer than Eleanor had yet seen it. "I have watched this household for 3 days now, watched my son and my grandson, and the woman who has quietly held this family together through its worst grief, and I find myself, at my age, with very little patience remaining for pretense. May I speak plainly?" "Of course, your grace." "My son loves you." The dowager said it simply, without preamble, and watched Eleanor's face color deeply at the words. "I do not believe he has fully admitted this to himself yet, being the careful and grief-hardened man he has become these past 2 years. But I have raised that boy since his own infancy, and I know the look of him when something has finally broken through the wall he built around his heart after his wife's death. I saw that look the night of the fever. I have seen it a dozen times since, whenever he believes no one is watching him watch you." Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap, uncertain how to answer such a direct pronouncement. "Your grace, I have never sought." "I know you have not sought it," the dowager said, not unkindly. "That is precisely why it matters so much. Lady Constance sought a title and a fortune, and pursued my son with all the transparent calculation of a woman playing a hand of cards. You sought nothing but the well-being of a motherless boy, and in doing so, you gave my son back a piece of himself he had believed lost for good. There is no comparison between the two of you, and I suspect, whatever fear you carry about your place in this house, that my son has already reached the same conclusion, if only he can find the courage to act on it. He is a duke," Eleanor said quietly. "I am nothing. A governess with no fortune, no family name worth mentioning. You are the woman who taught my grandson to laugh again," the dowager said, her voice firm. "You are the woman who sat through a fever that frightened even his father into remembering how to love him properly. Titles and fortunes are easily come by, Miss Whitmore, in one form or another. What you have given this family cannot be bought at any price, and I think, when the moment comes, my son will understand that as clearly as I do." She rose from the bench then, leaving Eleanor alone with the weight of her words, and made her way back toward the house with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had said precisely what needed saying, at precisely the moment it needed to be heard. Eleanor remained on the bench for a long while after the dowager had gone, watching the late afternoon light stretch long shadows across the garden, and allowed herself, for the first time since Lady Constance's campaign against her had begun, to imagine a future she had not previously dared to consider. She did not know if the dowager's confidence was well-founded. She did not know what Edmund himself felt, beyond gratitude and the fierce protectiveness he had shown in defending her against slander. But something had shifted in her too, quietly, in the telling of those words, a small and fragile hope she found she could no longer entirely suppress. She did not know that Edmund, standing at his study window some distance away, had watched the entire exchange between his mother and Eleanor without hearing a word of it, and had felt, watching Eleanor's face move through uncertainty, and then something that looked, even from this distance, like hope, a resolve settle over him that he had been circling for weeks without quite allowing himself to name. He turned from the window and reached for a sheet of fresh paper, and began, for the first time in 2 years, to write a letter that had nothing to do with estate business or grief, but everything to do with the future he had only just begun to let himself imagine. News of the retraction reached the servants' hall by supper that same evening, carried by the groom who had accompanied the Duke on his ride to Lord Vale's estate, and who had waited outside long enough to catch the general shape of what had passed between the two men, if not the particulars. Mrs. Pruitt received the news with visible relief, and made a point of seeking Eleanor out in the nursery that evening to share it. "It is finished, then," Eleanor said, though the words carried more uncertainty than relief. "Truly finished?" "As finished as such things can be," Mrs. Pruitt said, settling herself into the second chair beside Henry's bed, where the boy slept soundly, worn out from an afternoon spent chasing butterflies in the garden with an energy that spoke of his full recovery. "Lord Vale has given his word, and whatever else may be said of the man, he is not one to risk further conflict with a duke who has already made his displeasure so plainly known. I do not think you will hear from Lady Constance again, Eleanor, in this house or anywhere near it." Eleanor let out a long breath she had not realized she was holding, feeling some of the tension that had gathered in her shoulders over the past weeks finally begin to ease. "I hardly know what to feel. Relief, I suppose, and something else I cannot quite name." "I imagine I know what that something else might be," Mrs. Pruitt said, with the faint, knowing smile of a woman who had watched this particular story unfold from its earliest beginnings, and had her own private suspicions about where it was headed, though I will not press you on it tonight. You have had enough to weather these past weeks without an old housekeeper adding her own speculation to the pile. Eleanor managed a small, tired laugh at that, the first real laugh she had allowed herself in days, and the two women sat together in companionable silence for a while longer, watching Henry sleep, both of them carrying, in their own quiet way, the sense that the household around them stood on the edge of some larger change neither could yet fully name. The letter arrived at breakfast, carried on a silver tray by Mr. Bellamy, with the same careful formality he brought to every piece of correspondence, and Eleanor nearly dismissed it as another household notice, until she saw her own name written across the front, in a hand she now recognized instantly, having seen it once before on the note that had accompanied her wages at the close of the previous quarter. She opened it with unsteady fingers, alone in the small sitting room she used for her own rare moments of solitude, and found only a few lines, written in the Duke's careful, deliberate script. Miss Whitmore, it read, I would be grateful if you might join me in the garden this evening, once Henry has been settled for the night. There is a matter I wish to discuss with you, one I have delayed too long already. Edmund. She read the note 3 times before she trusted herself to fold it and place it carefully in the pocket of her dress, and spent the remainder of the day in a state of distracted anticipation that made even the simplest tasks of the nursery feel strangely unfamiliar, as though her hands moved through the motions of her ordinary work, while her mind remained fixed entirely on the evening ahead. Henry, sharp as ever despite his young age, noticed her distraction almost immediately. You are somewhere else today, Miss Eleanor. Am I? She said, forcing a smile as she helped him with his afternoon lessons. Forgive me. I have a great deal on my mind. Is it something bad? No, she said, and found, to her own surprise, that she believed it. I do not think it is bad at all. The day passed with an agonizing slowness that Eleanor had not experienced since her earliest, most uncertain weeks at Ashworth Hall, when every hour had seemed to stretch endlessly beneath the weight of her own uncertainty about her place in the household. She settled Henry for bed that evening with extra care, lingering a moment longer than usual at his bedside, humming the familiar wordless tune until his breathing deepened into sleep, before making her way downstairs and out into the garden where the last light of the summer evening still lingered gold and soft over the hedgerows. Edmund was already there, standing near the same bench where he had once sat beside her and Henry in the mild afternoon sun, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression, when he turned to see her approaching, unguarded in a way she had rarely witnessed in the 2 years she had known him. Thank you for coming, he said. Your note gave me little choice, Eleanor said, though her tone carried none of the wariness the words might have suggested. I confess I have thought of little else all day. A faint, uncertain smile touched his mouth. I find myself in a similar state, though I have had considerably longer than a single day to consider what I wish to say to you. He gestured toward the bench, and she sat, and he remained standing before her for a long moment, gathering himself in a way that reminded her, oddly, of the careful hesitation he had once shown at the nursery door during Henry's illness, a man unused to allowing himself to want something openly. I have spent 2 years, he began finally, believing myself finished with the kind of feeling I am about to describe. After my wife died, I convinced myself that whatever capacity I once had for that sort of happiness had died alongside her, and I built my life around that belief so thoroughly that I stopped questioning it. I retreated from my son because looking at him reminded me too painfully of what I had lost. I retreated from nearly everyone, in one way or another, and told myself it was grief, which it was, though it was also, I think, a kind of cowardice I am only now beginning to understand fully. Eleanor said nothing, sensing that he needed to reach the end of his own thought without interruption. And then you came into this household, he continued, quiet and unassuming, asking for nothing beyond a roof over your head and a chance to be useful, and somehow, without my ever quite noticing it happening, you gave my son back the mother he lost, and gave me back a version of myself I had believed gone for good. I watched you that first night, the night Henry woke from his nightmare, though you did not know I was there. I watched you build towers of wooden blocks and laugh at their falling. I watched you hold him through a fever that frightened me more than I have been frightened by anything since my wife's death, and I understood, somewhere in the middle of that long night, that whatever I had believed about my own capacity for feeling had been wrong. He knelt then, slowly, before the bench where she sat, and took her hand in both of his eyes steady on hers despite the uncertainty still visible in his expression. I do not offer you a title, Eleanor. though a title comes with what I am about to ask. I offer you a life built honestly, with a man who has finally remembered how to feel something beyond grief, and a boy who already loves you as completely as any child could love the woman who raised him through his mother's absence. I have spent weeks circling this question, uncertain whether I had any right to ask it of a woman who owes this family nothing beyond the wages it pays her, but I find I can no longer bear the uncertainty of not asking. Will you marry me? For a long moment, Eleanor could not find words at all, the weight of the question settling over her with a force that left her breathless, equal parts disbelief, and a joy so complete it frightened her slightly in its intensity. She thought of the Dowager Duchess's words in the garden, of the quiet hope she had allowed herself to carry since that conversation, and found that hope now standing fully realized before her, kneeling in the fading evening light with a sincerity she had never expected to witness from a man she had once believed permanently closed off from feeling. "Yes," she said finally, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Yes, Edmund, I will marry you." He rose then, and for a moment they simply stood together in the quiet garden. The weight of 2 years of careful distance finally dissolved into something neither of them had dared to imagine possible only weeks before. When he finally drew her into an embrace, gentle and full of a tenderness that spoke more clearly than any words could have managed, Eleanor felt, for the first time since arriving at Ashworth Hall with nothing but a single trunk and a letter of introduction, that she had finally found a home that could not be taken from her. News of the engagement spread through the household by the following morning, and the reaction, far from the scandal Lady Constance had once predicted, was one of near universal delight. Mrs. Pruitt wept openly when Eleanor told her, embracing her with a warmth that spoke of 2 years of quiet affection finally allowed its full expression. Mr. Bellamy, ordinarily the most composed member of the household staff, offered his congratulations with a formality that could not quite disguise the genuine pleasure in his expression. Even the youngest housemaids, who had watched Eleanor's quiet devotion to Henry from the earliest days of her arrival, celebrated the news with an enthusiasm that filled the servants' hall with a warmth Ashworth Hall had not known in years. The Dowager Duchess, when informed, allowed herself only a small, knowing smile, and remarked, to no one in particular, that she had suspected as much for some time, though she had learned long ago that such matters were best allowed to unfold at their own pace rather than being hurried along by an old woman's impatience. Henry's reaction, when finally told, was perhaps the simplest and most joyful of all. He had been informed by his father directly, sitting together in the nursery with Eleanor present, and upon hearing the news, he had thrown his arms around Eleanor's neck with a delighted shriek that carried through the entire East Wing. "You will truly be my mother now?" he asked, pulling back just enough to search her face with wide, hopeful eyes. "If you will have me," Eleanor said, her own eyes bright with tears. "I will have you forever," Henry declared, with all the absolute certainty of a child who had already claimed her as his own in every way that mattered, long before any formal arrangement had made the bond official. The formal announcement, when it came some days later, was made at a gathering considerably larger than the one that had first exposed Lady Constance's cruelty, attended by nearly every prominent family in the county, many of whom had, in the intervening weeks, heard some version of the scandal that had briefly threatened Eleanor's position, and had drawn their own quiet conclusions about the character of the woman at its center. Whatever whispers had once circulated about Miss Whitmore's supposed scheming were laid entirely to rest that evening, as the Duke of Ashworth stood before the assembled guests and spoke, with a warmth and openness that surprised many who had known him only as a grieving and distant figure, of the woman who had brought his household back to life. "I have spent 2 years," he told the gathered guests, Eleanor's hand held firmly in his own, believing that the happiest part of my life had already ended. I was wrong. It was only beginning, and I have Eleanor Whitmore to thank for showing me that truth, one small, quiet kindness at a time. The applause that followed was warm and genuine, and if any lingering doubts remained among the county's more gossip-inclined families, they were entirely overshadowed by the evident joy of the household itself, from the Dowager Duchess's quiet satisfaction to Henry's unrestrained delight as he stood between his father and the woman who would soon be his mother in name, as well as in every way that had ever truly mattered. In the weeks that followed the announcement, Ashworth Hall took on an energy it had not known in the 2 years since the late Duchess's passing. Preparations for the wedding began in earnest, and though Edmund insisted the ceremony remain modest in scale, in keeping with both his own temperament and Eleanor's evident discomfort at the thought of a grand society spectacle, the household nonetheless buzzed with a purposeful activity that touched every corner of the estate. Mrs. Pruitt took personal charge of overseeing the arrangements, treating the task with a fierce pride that left no doubt as to how deeply she had come to care for Eleanor over the past 2 years. She fussed over every detail with the devotion of a mother preparing her own daughter for marriage, and more than once Eleanor found herself laughing through unexpected tears at the housekeeper's insistence on some small point of preparation that seemed, to Eleanor's eyes, entirely unnecessary, but which clearly mattered a great deal to the older woman. "You have given this house more than you will ever know," Mrs. Pruitt told her one afternoon, adjusting the fit of a gown that had arrived from the dressmaker in the village. "Let an old woman fuss over you a little in return. It is the least you have earned." Henry, for his part, involved himself in the preparations with the enthusiastic and occasionally chaotic energy of a 5-year-old boy who had appointed himself chief supervisor of every decision made in the household, from the flowers to be arranged in the chapel to the particular song he insisted must be played during the ceremony, a favorite tune Eleanor had hummed to him so many times that he had come to think of it as belonging, in some essential way, to their small family alone. "It has to be that one," he insisted, when Eleanor gently suggested other options might be considered. "It is the song that makes everything better. It should be there when you become my mother properly." She could not argue with such logic, and the tune that had once calmed him through countless nightmares found its way, eventually, into the small chapel ceremony that would formally bind their family together. Edmund, meanwhile, spent much of the intervening weeks in quiet, private conversation with Eleanor, the two of them walking the estate grounds in the mild evenings, or sitting together in the garden after Henry had been settled for the night, learning each other in a manner neither had been permitted the leisure to pursue during the careful, watchful months that had preceded his proposal. Eleanor learned, in those conversations, of the young man Edmund had been before grief had reshaped him, a man who had once loved music and long rides through the countryside, and had allowed both to fall away in the aftermath of his wife's death. Edmund learned in turn of Eleanor's own quiet history, the family she had lost young, the years of uncertain positions and precarious arrangements that had taught her to expect little and ask for less, and the particular loneliness that had followed her until Henry's small hand had first found hers on a night much like the one that had first drawn Edmund's attention toward her. "I used to believe," Eleanor admitted one evening, as they walked together beneath a sky just beginning to darken toward night, "that I would spend my whole life being useful to other people's families, never quite belonging to one of my own. I had made my peace with it, or told myself I had." "I am glad you did not have to keep that peace much longer," Edmund said, taking her hand in his own with a warmth that had become, in these past weeks, entirely natural between them. "Though I confess I am somewhat ashamed it took me so long to see what was standing quietly in front of me the entire time." "You saw it in time," Eleanor said. "That is what matters now." He brought her hand to his lips, and they continued their walk in comfortable silence, the estate spread golden and quiet around them, both aware that whatever difficulties had shaped the path toward this moment, the future opening before them, now held a promise neither had believed themselves entitled to, only months before. The wedding itself, when it finally arrived on a bright morning in early autumn, was everything Edmund had promised. Modest in scale, attended only by the closest members of the household and a small handful of trusted friends and family, yet rich in a warmth that no grand society affair could have matched. The Dowager Duchess wept openly through the ceremony, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief while insisting, unconvincingly, that the autumn air had simply irritated them. Mrs. Pruitt stood near the front of the small gathered assembly, her hands clasped tightly together, her expression one of pure, unguarded pride. Henry stood beside his father throughout the ceremony, solemn with the importance of his role, and when the moment came for Eleanor to walk toward the small altar where Edmund waited, it was Henry's hand she held, the boy having insisted, with an authority no one in the household had thought to question, that he alone should have the honor of bringing her forward. Eleanor stood in the golden light of that morning, surrounded by a family she had once believed she could never truly belong to, and felt, for the first time in her life, entirely and completely at home. 5 years passed at Ashworth Hall, and the house that had once echoed with silence and careful guarded grief now rang, most days, with laughter that carried from the nursery down through every corridor of the great estate. Henry, now 10 years old, had grown into a bright, confident boy whose early years of quiet fear seemed, to anyone meeting him for the first time, almost impossible to imagine. He rode his own pony across the estate grounds with a fearlessness that occasionally sent his mother's heart into her throat, climbed the old oak tree near the garden wall with a skill that spoke of countless practiced attempts, and had developed, much to his father's quiet pride, a genuine passion for the same books of adventure stories that had once been read to him during his long recovery from the fever that had so nearly frightened his family apart. He was not, Eleanor often reflected, a boy who carried any visible scars from those early years of loss and distance. He remembered his mother, the first Duchess, with a gentle fondness shaped largely by the stories Eleanor and Edmund had carefully preserved for him, small memories and details neither parent wished him to lose entirely, even as his life had moved forward into new and happier chapters. He understood, in the simple, uncomplicated way children often manage such complexities better than adults, that he had been loved by two mothers in different ways, one who had given him life and one who had taught him, through 2 years of patient devotion, what it meant to feel safe again. 2 years after the wedding, a sister had joined the family, a small, dark-haired girl named Charlotte who had inherited her father's steady temperament and her mother's gentle warmth in equal measure, and who adored her older brother with an intensity that made Henry, despite occasional protests about the indignity of a younger sibling following him everywhere, secretly rather proud of the devotion. The nursery that had once held only Henry's small bed and his collection of wooden blocks now bustled with the noise and mess of 2 children, and Eleanor, watching them together on quiet afternoons, often found herself marveling at how completely her life had transformed from the uncertain, precarious existence she had carried with her upon first arriving at Ashworth Hall. Edmund had changed as much as his household, in the years since that fever-stricken night had first cracked open the careful distance he had built around his own heart. He remained, in matters of estate business and public affairs, the same measured and thoughtful man he had always been, respected throughout the county for his fairness and his steady judgment. But at home, among his family, he had become something the servants of Ashworth Hall had once believed permanently lost to grief. A father who knelt on the nursery floor to build towers of wooden blocks with his daughter, who rode alongside his son across the estate grounds with genuine delight rather than distant obligation, who greeted his wife each evening with a warmth that had only deepened in the years since their wedding rather than fading, as some had quietly predicted it might, once the initial glow of new marriage had settled into ordinary domestic life. The Dowager Duchess Margaret, now well into her later years but still sharp of mind and quick of wit, had taken to spending increasing portions of the year at Ashworth Hall, drawn by the particular joy of watching her grandchildren grow in a household so different from the grief-stricken years that had followed her daughter-in-law's death. She doted openly on both Henry and Charlotte, and had developed with Eleanor a genuine friendship that went well beyond the polite tolerance that sometimes characterized relationships between a woman and her mother-in-law, a friendship built on the shared, quiet satisfaction of having watched a broken family made whole again. I knew it from the very beginning, the Dowager was fond of saying, whenever the subject of Eleanor and Edmund's courtship arose among family or close friends, though Eleanor had come, over the years, to understand this claim with the same fond skepticism she applied to most of the Dowager's more dramatic pronouncements. I saw it in his face the moment he began asking after you, long before either of you had admitted anything to yourselves. Mrs. Pruitt, too, remained a constant and beloved presence at Ashworth Hall, her role in the household having evolved, over the years, from housekeeper to something closer to a cherished family elder, present at every important occasion, consulted on every significant decision regarding the household's management, and treated by both children with an affectionate familiarity typically reserved for a favorite grandmother. She had never married, having devoted her life instead to the running of the estate and the well-being of the families who had passed through it, and she often remarked, with quiet contentment, that watching Eleanor's story unfold, from frightened newcomer to beloved Duchess, had been one of the great privileges of her long service. Lady Constance Vale had, in the years following her banishment to her northern relations, eventually married a wealthy merchant's son whose fortune, if not his lineage, satisfied enough of her original ambitions to secure a comfortable if unremarkable life, far from the county where her schemes had once caused such disruption. She was rarely spoken of at Ashworth Hall, and when her name did arise it was generally met with little more than a passing, faintly amused remark from the Dowager Duchess about ambitions that had ultimately cost more than they had ever promised to deliver. On quiet evenings, once the children had been settled into their beds and the great house had begun to still around them, Eleanor and Edmund often found themselves in the same garden where he had once knelt before her beneath the fading summer light, sitting together now in comfortable, easy silence, watching the stars emerge over the estate they had built their family upon. "Do you ever think of that first night?" Edmund asked her once, some years into their marriage, as they sat together beneath a sky heavy with early stars. "The night I found you with Henry, though you did not know I was watching?" "Often," Eleanor admitted. I think of how frightened I was, in those early years, of losing the only home I had managed to build for myself. I did not imagine, not for a moment, that watching over a frightened little boy would eventually lead me here. Nor did I imagine, Edmund said, drawing her closer against his side, that grief could ever fully release its hold on me, until I watched you hum a boy back to sleep and felt something in my chest that I had believed gone forever. They sat together in the quiet garden as the stars deepened overhead, two people who had each, in their own way, been rescued from a kind of quiet despair by an unlikely and unassuming act of devotion, one that had asked for nothing in return, and had, in the end, been given everything. Inside the great house, Henry and Charlotte slept soundly in their beds, secure in a home built not on the careful distances of grief and duty, but on the steady, patient warmth of a woman who had once believed herself destined to remain forever on the outside of other people's families, and who had found, instead, a family entirely her own. There were moments, still, when Eleanor found herself thinking of the woman she had been before Ashworth Hall, the quiet, careful young woman who had arrived with a single trunk and no expectations of ever being truly wanted anywhere. She did not resent that woman, or the years of uncertainty that had shaped her into someone so accustomed to asking for little and expecting less. If anything, she felt a kind of tenderness toward her, understanding now, with the clarity that only distance and happiness could provide, how much quiet courage it had taken to keep showing up, night after night, for a boy who was not hers to love, simply because he had needed someone, and she had been the one willing to stay. She thought, too, of Mrs. Pruitt's steady kindness in those early years, of the small acts of faith the housekeeper had shown her long before anyone else in the household had troubled to notice her at all, and made certain, as her own position within the family grew more secure, that such kindness was never forgotten or taken for granted. It was Eleanor who insisted, each year, on a proper celebration of Mrs. Pruitt's long service to the family, and Eleanor who ensured the older woman's later years were spent in comfort and genuine appreciation, rather than the quiet, unthanked labor that had so often been the fate of devoted servants before her. Henry, as he grew older, began to understand more fully the story of how his parents had come together, pieced together from the fond, occasionally embellished retellings offered by his grandmother and the housekeeper alike. He took a particular pride in his own small role in the tale, the fever that had first cracked open his father's careful distance, the insistence on a particular song at the wedding that had, in the years since, become something of a family tradition, played each year on the anniversary of his parents' marriage. "You saved us both, you know," he told Eleanor once, on the eve of his 12th birthday, with the sudden, startling insight children sometimes offer, without quite understanding the full weight of what they have said. "Papa and me. I do not think either of us would have found our way back without you." Eleanor had not known, in that moment, how to answer such a statement, beyond drawing her son into an embrace, and holding him the way she had held him on so many long nights years before, grateful beyond words for the strange, winding path that had brought her to this family, this home, this life she had once believed entirely beyond her reach. Charlotte, still young enough to see the world in simpler terms, asked her mother once why she had chosen to love a house full of strangers before she had ever known they would become her family. "I did not choose to love a house full of strangers," Eleanor told her gently, smoothing her daughter's dark hair back from her face. "I simply chose to be kind to a little boy who needed kindness, without expecting anything to come of it. Everything else followed on its own, in its own time." It was a lesson she hoped both her children would carry forward into their own lives, long after she and Edmund had grown old together within these walls. That love rarely announced itself with grand gestures or careful calculation, but arrived instead in small, patient acts of devotion, offered freely and without expectation, until one day, if a person was fortunate enough, those small acts gathered together into something as vast and as certain as the life she had built at Ashworth Hall. Ashworth Hall, once a house defined by its silence, had become, in the years since Eleanor Whitmore's quiet arrival, a home defined instead by its laughter, and by the particular unshakable love of a father who had learned, through her patient example, how to hold his children close again, and of a mother who had never once forgotten the small, frightened boy who had first taught her what it meant to belong somewhere fully, and completely, and for good.